Dr. Marcus Chen picked his way through the rubble-strewn streets of what had been a small city on Kareth 9, before the war turned it into twisted metal and broken concrete. The fighting had moved away from this sector 3 days ago, both the Vortian Imperial forces and the coalition troops retreating or advancing, depending on whose strategic assessment you believed, leaving behind the wounded and dying that neither side had managed to evacuate in their haste. Marcus and his small medical team from Humanitarian Aid Coalition had established a makeshift facility in what remained of a reinforced basement, and they'd been treating whoever they could find for the past week, regardless of which side of the conflict they'd been fighting for. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking. They lacked proper equipment. Medical supplies were running critically low despite recent airdrops, and far too many of their patients died despite Marcus's best efforts. But he persisted because this was what he dedicated his life to: providing medical care to those who suffered in war zones, believing deeply that health care was a fundamental right that transcended politics and warfare. He'd been doing this for over a decade, moving from one conflict zone to another across human space, and now in alien conflicts where humans had some presence as neutral parties. His friends and family thought he was either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish, possibly both. But Marcus simply felt he was doing what needed to be done by someone with his training and his ethical commitments. He was checking the area where they'd recovered several casualties yesterday when he spotted something under collapsed debris that made him pause: the distinctive ridge-patterned skin of a Vortian warrior visible beneath the rubble. The Vortian were the most feared military power in this sector. Their empire had been expanding aggressively for decades through conquest and subjugation, and their warriors were legendary for their combat prowess, their discipline, and their ruthlessness. This particular Vortian appeared to be female based on the facial structure Marcus had learned to recognize, and she was clearly in terrible condition. Her armor was breached in multiple places. Blood had pooled around her from wounds Marcus couldn't see clearly yet, and she was barely conscious, her distinctive multi-spectrum eyes unfocused and glazed with pain and blood loss. Marcus's immediate medical assessment cataloged the visible injuries: significant trauma to her torso where the armor was breached, likely internal bleeding given the amount of external blood present, what appeared to be a fractured arm at minimum, signs of head trauma from the collapse, and severe blood loss making her skin patterns dull and grayish rather than the healthy colors he'd observed on other Vortian patients. Without treatment soon, she would die, probably within the next few hours, possibly sooner if the internal bleeding was as severe as he suspected. He made his decision immediately, calling for his team's assistance through his comm unit. 2 volunteers came quickly with a stretcher and emergency medical supplies. They worked together to carefully extract the Vortian warrior from the rubble, stabilizing her head and neck as much as possible given the circumstances, and transported her to their medical facility with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done emergency extractions too many times to count. As they moved her, Marcus noticed that her armor, while obviously high quality and well-maintained, didn't have the extensive rank markings he'd seen on Vortian officers they'd previously treated. She was probably a regular soldier, maybe mid-level at most, which made sense. Officers were usually better protected and more likely to be successfully evacuated when units retreated. At the medical facility, a reinforced basement with jury-rigged medical equipment, improvised surgical areas, and supplies that were never quite adequate for the caseload they were treating, Marcus and his team began emergency intervention. They cut away the damaged armor to access her wounds, revealing the full extent of her injuries, which were even worse than Marcus had feared. Penetrating trauma to her abdomen with clear signs of internal hemorrhaging, multiple rib fractures that had probably punctured something internally. The arm fracture he'd noted was actually a compound break requiring immediate stabilization, and significant head trauma with possible intracranial bleeding. It was about as bad as injuries could be while still leaving the patient technically alive. The Vortian woman regained brief consciousness during their initial assessment, her eyes focusing on Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. Surprise, confusion, pain all mixing together. She tried to speak, her voice barely audible, and the words in Vortian language that his translation implant struggled to process due to her weakened state affecting pronunciation. Why? Was all he could make out clearly before she lost consciousness again. It's okay, Marcus told her anyway, maintaining the calm professional tone he used with all his patients. You're badly injured, but we're going to help you. Just try to stay still and let us work. Whether she heard him or understood before passing out, he didn't know, but saying it felt important anyway. He always talked to his patients even when unconscious. It helped him maintain his focus and reminded him that these were people, not just medical challenges to be solved. The emergency surgery lasted 6 hours. Marcus worked with focused intensity, repairing internal damage, stopping bleeding, stabilizing fractures, treating the head trauma as best he could with their limited equipment. His team assisted with practice competence. They'd all become far too experienced at performing complex surgeries in suboptimal conditions, using improvised techniques when they lacked proper tools, making life-or-death decisions about resource allocation when they couldn't provide optimal care to everyone. The Vortian woman crashed twice during the surgery, her vital signs dropping to critical levels, and both times Marcus managed to pull her back through a combination of medical skill, determination, and probably some luck. By the time they finished, he was exhausted. His hands were shaking from adrenaline and fatigue, and he wasn't entirely certain she'd survive the next 24 hours despite their best efforts. But she was stable, or as stable as someone with her injuries could be, and that was the most he could achieve under the circumstances. Over the following days, Marcus monitored her carefully, adjusting treatments as her condition evolved, watching for the infections that were almost inevitable given their non-sterile conditions, managing her pain as best he could with their limited pharmaceutical supplies. She remained mostly unconscious or semi-conscious, which was probably for the best given the severity of her injuries and the discomfort of recovery. During the quiet hours when his team was busy with other patients, Marcus often found himself alone with the Vortian woman, checking her vital signs, changing dressings, talking to her even though she probably couldn't hear him in her unconscious state. He told her about himself, about growing up on Earth, about why he'd become a doctor, about his belief that healing people was valuable work regardless of politics or warfare. He told her about the other patients they were treating, about small victories when someone they thought might die pulled through, about the grief he felt when they lost patients despite doing everything possible. It helped him process the stress of working in this impossible situation, and maybe some part of him hoped she could hear him on some level and would find comfort in knowing someone cared about her recovery. On the 4th day, she fully regained consciousness while Marcus was checking the healing of her abdominal wounds. Her eyes opened and immediately focused on him with startling intensity. Marcus had a moment of genuine fear. He'd heard stories about Vortian warriors fighting even when severely injured, and he was suddenly very aware that despite her injuries, she was still a trained combat specialist who could probably kill him without much effort if she chose to. But instead of attacking, she just studied him silently for a long moment, her expression unreadable in ways that reminded Marcus how little he actually understood about Vortian emotional displays and body language. He maintained his professional calm despite his nervousness, smiling gently in the way he'd learned could help reassure frightened or confused patients. "Welcome back. You've been unconscious for several days. You were very badly injured, but you're going to recover with time and care. I'm Dr. Marcus Chen, though you can just call me Marcus. Can you understand me? Is the translation working properly?" She nodded slowly, still watching him with that intense focus that was simultaneously unnerving and somehow compelling. When she finally spoke, Her voice was weak but clear enough for the translation to render it properly. "Why did you help me? I am Vorshin. We are enemies of your coalition allies. Why would you treat me?" It was a question Marcus had been asked before by other Vorshin patients, and his answer remained consistent. "Because you needed help and I'm a doctor. That's reason enough for me. I don't fight wars. I just try to reduce the suffering they cause for anyone who's suffering regardless of which side they're on." She processed this in silence, her expression shifting through configurations that Marcus still couldn't properly interpret, but which seemed to indicate she found his answer somehow surprising or significant. Then she asked, her tone carrying something that might have been genuine curiosity rather than challenge. "What is your name again? You said it, but my translator struggled with the pronunciation when I was less conscious." "Marcus Chen, doctor." "Marcus Chen, but honestly just Marcus is fine. You don't need to be formal with me." "Marcus." She tested the pronunciation, her accent making it sound slightly exotic. "I am." She paused as if wrestling with something before simply finishing. "I am Kira." Later, much later, Marcus would learn that Vorshin warriors typically introduced themselves with full names including clan affiliations and military ranks, and that providing only a personal name was extremely unusual. But in the moment, he simply accepted the introduction at face value. "Good to meet you, Kira. Now please rest. Your body needs time to heal, and you're safe here while you recover." Over the following 2 weeks, Kira recovered under Marcus's consistent care, progressing from barely able to move without severe pain to regaining significant mobility and strength. Marcus maintained his professional approach, checking on her regularly, explaining each treatment, asking about her comfort and pain levels, adjusting care as needed based on how she was healing. But he also treated her as a person rather than just a patient or an enemy combatant, bringing her books and entertainment media once she was alert enough to be bored by bed rest, making sure she had materials in Vorshin language or with proper translation, occasionally sitting with her and talking about non-medical topics when his schedule allowed, and when she seemed receptive to conversation. Kira, for her part, observed everything with careful attention. She watched how Marcus interacted with all his patients, the coalition soldiers who viewed him with gratitude mixed with pity for working in such terrible conditions, the Vorshin wounded who mostly regarded him with confusion about why an enemy would help them, and the few surviving civilians who looked at him like he was the only good thing left in their shattered lives. Marcus treated them all the same, with competence, with kindness, with genuine care that seemed to cost him emotionally when patients didn't make it, but which never diminished his commitment to helping whoever needed help. For Kira, raised in Vorshin culture that valued strength and combat prowess above all else, this was almost incomprehensible. Vorshin didn't generally dedicate themselves to healing others, especially not enemies. Warriors who were too injured to fight were expected to either recover through their own resilience or die with dignity, rather than burden others with extensive care. The concept of someone spending their life providing care to the wounded regardless of which side they fought on was so foreign to Vorshin cultural frameworks that Kira initially struggled to even make sense of it. But as she recovered and observed more, she began to understand that Marcus wasn't weak despite his lack of warrior training or combat skills. He displayed a different kind of strength, the strength to remain compassionate and committed to his ethics even in circumstances that were physically dangerous, emotionally devastating, and ethically complex. She saw how he worked himself to exhaustion trying to save everyone he could, how he grieved quietly when patients died despite his best efforts, how he celebrated with genuine joy when someone he thought might not survive pulled through. She noticed that his small team clearly respected him, not because they feared his authority, but because they believed in his mission and his approach, and that he treated them as valued colleagues rather than as subordinates to be commanded. During one of their longer conversations during a quiet evening when no new casualties had arrived for treatment, and Marcus actually had time to sit down, Kira asked him directly about his background and motivations. You said you don't fight in wars, that you just try to reduce suffering. But you are human. Your species has military forces. You could have joined them, could have been trained as a warrior rather than as a healer. Why did you choose this path instead? Marcus considered how to answer, leaning back against the wall of the reinforced basement that served as their medical facility. I guess I've always believed that healing people matters more than hurting them. Don't get me wrong. I understand why militaries exist, why people fight to defend their homes and their values. But I couldn't see myself as a soldier. I can do more good in the world by helping people survive and recover than I could by being just another person with a weapon. And working in war zones like this, someone has to be willing to treat everyone regardless of which side they're on. If we only help our own side, then we're just perpetuating the cycles of violence rather than trying to reduce suffering wherever it occurs. Kira processed this carefully before responding. In Vortian culture, you would be viewed as weak. You are not a warrior. You dedicate your life to healing rather than fighting, and you extend care even to your enemies. But I have observed you carefully during my recovery, and I do not believe you are weak. You have a different kind of strength, one that my people do not recognize or value, but which is no less real for being different. I am not certain whether our cultural dismissal of approaches like yours represents wisdom, or whether it represents a fundamental limitation that makes us powerful in war, but perhaps deficient in other ways that might matter equally. That's very thoughtful, Marcus said, genuinely impressed by her willingness to question her own culture's assumptions. Different situations call for different kinds of strength. Combat requires courage and physical capability, obviously. But so does what I do, staying in war zones when I could leave, treating people knowing many will return to combat and might kill people on my side, watching patients suffer and die despite my best efforts. It's a different kind of courage than what warriors need, but it's still courage. I think cultures that only recognize one kind of strength are missing something important about what humans, or Vortian or any species, are capable of. Their conversation was interrupted by alarms indicating new casualties arriving. A group of coalition soldiers who'd been caught in a delayed munitions explosion and were in terrible shape. Marcus immediately shifted into professional mode, organizing his team and diving into the emergency treatment that would occupy the next several hours. Kira watched him work from her recovery bed, observing his focused competence, his steady hands despite obvious fatigue, his calm voice directing his team and reassuring the injured soldiers even as he performed complex emergency procedures. She found herself thinking about leadership and strength in ways she never had before. In Vortian military culture, leadership meant commanding through authority and demonstrated combat superiority, earning respect through victory and tactical brilliance. But Marcus led his team differently, through example, through shared commitment to their mission, through trust and mutual respect rather than hierarchy and command. And his team followed him with dedication that rivaled any military units, working themselves to exhaustion because they believed in what they were doing rather than because they feared punishment for failure. Over the second week of recovery, Kira began telling Marcus more about herself, carefully edited to maintain her anonymity, but honest about her experiences and perspective. She described growing up in a culture that valued strength and victory above all else, that trained children from young ages for combat, that measured worth primarily through martial achievement. She talked about the loneliness of being valued only for what you could do rather than for who you were as a person. She admitted that watching Marcus work and interact with people had made her question assumptions she'd held her entire life about what truly mattered and what kinds of strength deserved respect and recognition. Marcus listened thoughtfully, not judging, but also not shying away from pointing out the costs of cultures built primarily around warfare and conquest. I've worked in war zones across dozens of conflicts, he told her. And what I've learned is that war destroys more than just buildings and bodies. It damages cultures and communities in ways that last for generations. The best outcome I can imagine isn't one side winning decisively. It's both sides finding ways to stop fighting and start building instead. I know that probably sounds naive to someone from a warrior culture, but I've seen too much death and suffering to believe that military victory alone ever really solves the underlying problems that cause conflicts in the first place. But Kira found herself unable to easily dismiss this perspective despite how foreign it was to her training and experience. The arrival of Vortian forces ended their unusual interlude abruptly. The medical facility was quickly surrounded by elite Vortian troops, and Marcus's team was understandably terrified. But then Kira appeared, transformed from recovering patient in medical gowns to commanding presence in formal military attire, moving with authority that made it immediately clear she was far more important than Marcus had imagined. When she spoke, every Vortian warrior in the area immediately knelt in obvious deference, and Marcus's stomach dropped as he realized that the person he'd been treating as just another injured soldier was actually someone of enormous importance whose identity he'd completely failed to recognize. "This facility and everyone within it are under my personal protection," Kira declared in a voice that carried absolute authority across the area. "No harm will come to the humans or to any patient currently receiving care here. This is my direct command. Is that understood?" The Vortian warriors responded with emphatic unanimous acknowledgement that left no doubt about their obedience. Kira turned to face Marcus, and her expression was complex, showing what might have been regret mixed with resignation and something else Marcus couldn't identify. "Dr. Marcus Chen, I owe you an explanation and an apology. I have not been entirely honest about who I am. My full designation is Empress Kurathan, Supreme Commander of the Vortian Imperial Military and ruler of the Vortian Empire. You saved the life of your coalition, Allies' primary enemy, without knowing it." Marcus felt like reality had shifted beneath his feet. The implications cascaded through his mind with dizzying speed. He'd spent 2 weeks treating the Vortian Empress, the single individual most responsible for the military campaigns that had devastated Karath 9 and dozens of other worlds. The most feared military leader in this entire sector of the galaxy had been lying in one of his medical cots while he told her stories about growing up on Earth and asked her opinion about human literature he was reading. It was surreal and terrifying in ways he was still processing, but even through his shock, his core ethics and medical training asserted themselves. You were injured and needed help. That doesn't change regardless of who you are or what position you hold. Kira's expression shifted to something that might have been approval or possibly sadness. That response is characteristically you, Dr. Chen. And it is precisely why I must ensure that you and your people are protected, despite the significant political and military complications that this situation presents. Over the following hours, as Vortian forces secured the area and established a formal command post, the full complexity of the situation became clear through bits of information Marcus overheard or was directly told. Kira's presence on Karath 9 had been a closely guarded secret. She'd been personally leading a special operation that had gone catastrophically wrong, resulting in the total loss of her elite guard unit and her near death under rubble where Marcus had found her. Her disappearance over the past 2 weeks had been a major crisis for Vortian military command, and her recovery was simultaneously an enormous relief and a massive political complication. The fact that she'd been rescued and cared for by human civilians who were technically neutral, but whose sympathies likely lay with the coalition, created diplomatic complexities that would take weeks or months to fully work through. Kira insisted on personally debriefing Marcus, and during their private conversation, the first time they'd been alone since the revelation of her identity, she addressed the situation with characteristic directness. You should understand that there are factions within my military command who are arguing that you and your team should be eliminated as security risks. You have seen me in a vulnerable state. You could potentially share intelligence about my injuries or my presence here, and there are conservative elements who view any weakness displayed to enemies as something that must be erased to maintain the appearance of invincibility. Marcus felt genuine fear at this statement but tried to keep his voice steady. Are you telling me that because you're warning me, or because you're explaining what's going to happen to us? I am telling you so you understand the political situation, but I want you to know that I will not allow it to happen. You saved my life when you had no obligation to do so, when doing so actually placed you at considerable risk, and you treated me with consistent care and respect throughout my recovery. That creates a debt and an obligation that I will honor regardless of political convenience or pressure from my advisors. You and your team will be protected, and I will ensure safe passage for you to leave Kareth 9 if you choose to evacuate. And if we choose to stay and continue our medical work here? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Kira's expression showed something that might have been respect mixed with exasperation. Then I will ensure that Vortian forces do not interfere with your operations, and will provide whatever protection I can arrange. Though I must warn you that this area will become an active combat zone again within days as military operations resume, and I cannot protect you from coalition forces, or from the wounded people here, from both sides and civilians caught in the middle, who need medical care. Leaving them would mean abandoning them to suffer and die when I have the skills to help them. As long as I can provide useful medical assistance, I stay. That's always been my approach to this work. Even knowing that many of those you successfully treat will return to combat and may kill your fellow humans or your coalition allies. It was a question Marcus had wrestled with many times, and he still didn't have a perfect answer. I don't have an easy response to that ethical dilemma, but I believe that providing medical care is a fundamental good that exists somewhat separately from the politics and strategies of warfare. If I start making decisions about who deserves treatment based on which side they're on, or what they might do after recovering, I've compromised something essential about what it means to be a physician. I can't control what people do after I heal them, but I can control whether I honor my obligation to provide care to anyone who needs it regardless of other factors. Kira studied him silently for a long moment before responding. Your ethical framework is profoundly foreign to traditional Vortian military thinking, but I am beginning to understand that it has merit that we do not recognize within our cultural frameworks. I observed you very carefully during my recovery, Dr. Chen. The way you approach your work, the way you treat everyone, enemy and ally alike, with equal care, the principles you hold to despite the personal cost and danger. These represent a form of strength that Vortian culture dismisses as weakness, but which I now believe may be a fundamental limitation in our thinking that has made us powerful in warfare, but perhaps deficient in other ways that matter equally or more. I appreciate that you're willing to question those cultural assumptions, Marcus said carefully. But I need to be honest that knowing who you are has changed things for me as well. You're personally responsible for ordering the military campaigns that have killed millions of sentient beings across dozens of worlds. The devastation on this planet and many others happened because of strategic decisions you made. I can separate treating you as a patient from my moral evaluation of you as a political and military leader, but I can't pretend those evaluations don't exist or that they don't trouble me significantly. I would not expect or want you to pretend otherwise. I am who I am, and I have done what I have done in service of what I believed were the interests of my empire and my people. But meeting you and observing your work over the past 2 weeks has complicated my understanding of what strength means, and what kinds of achievements deserve respect and value. You are not a warrior by any definition Vortian culture would recognize, but you display courage equal to any warrior I have known. You care for enemies as readily as allies, which Vortian military doctrine would classify as strategic foolishness. Yet your medical facility has saved dozens of lives, including my own. I do not have immediate answers to the questions your approach raises, but I am beginning to believe that my culture's automatic dismissal of everything except martial prowess and military victory may be costing us more than we realize in ways we do not measure or value. Their conversation was interrupted by urgent reports that coalition forces were mounting a major counterattack toward this position, having apparently detected the Vortian command presence. Kira had to return immediately to her command duties, but before leaving, she made one final statement. Regardless of what happens next in this campaign or this war, I will remember what you did for me and the questions your approach to life and ethics has raised for me. That may not seem significant, but I can promise you that an empress's memory and her willingness to question her own culture's assumptions can have far-reaching consequences that extend well beyond any individual interaction. The battle that followed over the next 2 days was among the most intense fighting Marcus had witnessed in his decade of working in war zones. The coalition had apparently decided this was an opportunity to strike at high-value Vortian command presence, and they threw significant forces at the position despite the cost. Vortian forces defended with characteristic discipline and overwhelming firepower. Marcus and his team sheltered in their reinforced medical facility, treating casualties from both sides as they were brought in or as they stumbled in seeking help. True to Kira's word, Vortian forces actively protected the medical facility, even when doing so created tactical disadvantages, redirecting forces specifically to ensure no coalition assault could reach the civilian medics. Marcus noticed this protection and understood its significance. Kira was spending military resources and possibly accepting tactical costs, specifically, to honor her commitment to protecting him and his team. The coalition attack was eventually repelled with heavy casualties on both sides, but the area was left even more devastated than before, and both forces pulled back somewhat to regroup and tend to their wounded. In the immediate aftermath, as both sides established temporary informal ceasefires in the immediate area to recover casualties and stabilize positions, Marcus received a message through Vortian command channels requesting his presence at the Imperial command post. He went with significant trepidation, uncertain what to expect but knowing he didn't really have the option to refuse an Empress's summons. The command post was a study in contrasts. Sophisticated military technology set up in the ruins of buildings, Vortian officers moving with efficient purpose, and at the center of it all, Empress Kurathan coordinating forces, reviewing tactical displays, making strategic decisions with the kind of calm authority that made it clear why she was considered the most brilliant military mind in Vortian history. It was jarring seeing her fully in her role as military commander after spending 2 weeks with her as a patient who'd been vulnerable and relatively powerless. She dismissed her staff when Marcus arrived, and once they were alone, her command presence softened slightly though didn't disappear entirely. "Dr. Chen, thank you for coming. I wanted to inform you personally of several decisions I have made. First, I am issuing new operational protocols regarding the treatment of medical facilities and humanitarian workers throughout this entire sector. Vortian forces will henceforth recognize medical neutrality according to Galactic conventions and will provide active protection to clearly marked humanitarian operations, regardless of which populations they serve. This represents a significant change from our previous operational protocols, which generally ignored such distinctions as strategically irrelevant." Marcus was genuinely surprised and moved by this announcement. That will make a real difference for medical teams working in conflict zones throughout the sector. It will save lives on all sides. Thank you for implementing this policy. It is a direct result of observing your work and considering the perspective you represent. I cannot fundamentally change Vortian culture or our overall strategic approach to warfare, but I can adjust our treatment of medical operations. Consider it a partial payment of the considerable debt I owe you for my life, and for the questions you have caused me to begin asking about what truly matters and what kinds of strength deserve recognition. She continued, "Second, I want to formally offer you and your team safe passage off Karath 9. Your work here has been remarkably valuable and has saved many lives, but this planet is going to become even more heavily contested in the coming weeks, and despite my best efforts and intentions, I cannot guarantee your safety indefinitely when you are in the middle of an active war zone." Marcus considered this carefully. Part of him desperately wanted to accept the offer. The situation was clearly becoming untenable, and continuing to stay risked not only his own life, but the lives of his team members who trusted his judgment. But there were still wounded people here who needed care, still patients in their facility who weren't stable enough to be moved, and abandoning them felt wrong in ways that went against everything he dedicated his life to. I genuinely appreciate the offer, and I understand the wisdom of accepting it, but I think I need to stay at least a while longer, as long as I can continue to do useful medical work here. If the situation becomes completely impossible, I promise I'll reconsider." Kira's expression showed something that might have been frustration mixed with grudging respect. "You are remarkably stubborn and dedicated for someone who claims to be a non-combatant. Very well, I will not force you to evacuate against your will, but I will ensure you have access to additional medical resources and whatever protection I can arrange. However, you need to understand that there are limits to what even an Empress can guarantee in an active combat zone, and I would not want to fail to protect someone who showed me such extraordinary care when I was vulnerable." They spent the next hour talking about various topics beyond just the immediate tactical situation. Marcus found himself sharing more than he'd intended about his own doubts and struggles, about the emotional toll of constantly losing patients despite his best efforts, about questioning whether his work actually made meaningful difference when the wars just continued regardless, about his hope that someday his medical skills would be applied to helping people live peaceful lives, rather than just trying to keep war casualties alive long enough to potentially be sent back to fight again. Kira, in turn, shared perspectives about leadership and command that Marcus suspected she rarely discussed with anyone. She described the profound loneliness of absolute authority, where every interaction with her own people was colored by their fear of her power and their political calculations, where genuine honest conversation was nearly impossible, because everyone was always positioning themselves rather than simply being authentic. "You treated me differently during my recovery because you did not know who I was," she admitted with unusual vulnerability. "You saw me as just another injured person who needed care, not as empress or military commander or political power. You simply cared for me as one sentient being helping another. No one has treated me that way in longer than I can remember. Everyone else sees the Empress first and exclusively, every word carefully calculated, every interaction measured against how it might affect their position or their plans. You just helped me because I needed help. That was valuable in ways that are difficult to adequately express." Marcus found himself genuinely moved by this admission. "I think I understand more than you might expect. I've seen loneliness of position in other contexts. Leaders who are isolated by their authority, who can't trust that anyone around them is being genuinely honest versus just telling them what they want to hear. But I should tell you that even knowing who you are now, my fundamental approach wouldn't actually change. If you showed up injured at my medical facility tomorrow not as Empress, but just as someone who needed help, I would treat you with exactly the same care I would give anyone else. Your titles and power don't fundamentally change the ethical obligation to provide medical care to anyone who's suffering. That absoluteness of principle is what makes you remarkable, Dr. Chen. Most beings' ethics are contingent. They apply when convenient or when the subject is sympathetic, but they bend or break when circumstances make them costly or uncomfortable. Yours appear to be genuinely absolute, applied consistently regardless of circumstances or consequences. That is extraordinarily rare and valuable. Their conversation was interrupted by new intelligence reports requiring Kira's immediate attention, and Marcus needed to return to his medical facility where new casualties were arriving. But before they parted, Kira made a final statement that stayed with Marcus. "I cannot undo the campaigns I have ordered or the deaths that have resulted from my strategic decisions over the years. I have commanded Vortian military forces. I am who I am, and I have responsibilities to my empire and my people that will always supersede personal feelings or preferences. But I want you to know that meeting you, observing your work, and considering the questions your approach raises has genuinely changed how I think about strength, about worth, and about what truly matters beyond simple military victory. That may not seem like much, but changes in how an empress thinks and what an empress values can have significant downstream effects throughout an entire civilization. I hope that someday, those effects might contribute to less suffering rather than more, though I know that hope may seem inadequate given the harm I have already caused." Months passed. Marcus eventually did evacuate from Karath 9, when the fighting became so intense that continuing medical operations became genuinely impossible, but not before spending several more months providing care to whoever needed it. Throughout that time and in the months after, he noticed changes in Vortian military behavior throughout the sector. Medical facilities were increasingly protected and respected as neutral. Civilian casualties decreased significantly. Rules of engagement seemed to shift toward less collateral damage. And most remarkably, there were preliminary peace negotiations initiated for the first time in the decades-long conflict. Marcus didn't know how much of this was due to his interaction with Kira versus other strategic or political factors, but he allowed himself to hope that maybe his simple act of providing medical care to an injured person without knowing or caring about their identity might have contributed somehow to broader changes. A year after first finding Kira under that rubble, Marcus received a personal message through secure diplomatic channels. It was from Empress Kurathan, formal in structure, but with personal elements that suggested it genuinely came from her rather than just being an official communication from her office. The message thanked him again for saving her life, but more importantly, it thanked him for showing her a different way of thinking about strength and value. She wrote that the policy changes regarding medical neutrality and civilian protection were specifically because of what she learned observing his work and considering his perspectives. She acknowledged that these changes couldn't undo the harm her empire had caused, but she hoped they represented meaningful steps toward an empire that valued more than just conquest and military victory. The final paragraph was unexpectedly personal. "I will remember our conversations and those strange 2 weeks when you treated me as just a person rather than as empress for the rest of my life. Being cared for by someone who had no agenda beyond helping another being in need was a gift I did not know I needed until I experienced it. You showed me that strength comes in many forms, and that some of the most important forms are ones my culture has systematically undervalued. That lesson will influence how I lead and what I choose to prioritize in ways that may surprise those who think they know me. With respect and gratitude, Kurathan." Marcus sat in his peaceful medical clinic on Earth, treating everyday ailments rather than war trauma for the first time in years, reflecting on how one simple act, treating an injured person's wounds without knowing or caring about their identity, had potentially influenced the policies of the most powerful military empire in the galaxy, demonstrating that sometimes profound effects come from simple ethical commitments: to care for those who suffer, to treat everyone with dignity regardless of who they are, and to hold to those principles even when circumstances make them difficult or dangerous, because that's what it means to value sentient life above politics and power.